Hi, everybody. It's time for 5 Minute Friday. I've been writing today about diversity in the church, spiritual gifts, superpowers, and something called the adjacent possible. My son Kirk taught me that phrase first. It was coined by Stephen Kaufman, who's an evolutionary biologist. About the quality within biological systems and also within economies and people and groups that he sees that causes any organism, including human being, when faced with a difficult problem, to reach toward the assets that are quickly available and cobble together a solution. And this is the key to our success as a species. I love the movie Princess Bride, and I watched it recently with my grandchildren. And if you remember at the end, when they're dragging poor little Wesley, who's only mostly dead, right, to the wall, and they're going to try to attack 60 people and get in the castle, he says, "What are our assets?" Right away, he says, "What are our assets?" So as we approach solving an unsolvable problem in 5 minutes or less, I would like you to think of the problem that is most bothering you right now. I have one. You got one? I got one. Okay, so here are some components of that problem. One is that there are probably many options that you could choose. Two, none of them sound good. And three, everybody disagrees on what you ought to do next. So with that in mind, let's consider your assets. The reason I've been thinking about this is because I'm writing about the book of Corinthians. Corinth was a busy port city, was full of all sorts of diverse populations, and a lot of Gentiles joined the church. There were Orthodox Jews sort of at the center of it. These people couldn't even eat a meal in the same room, let alone have church together. They could not figure out how to organize a congregation. Paul is writing to them. You talk about an unsolvable problem. He's not even there to do it in person. So how do you solve this problem? Now, the Jewish tendency, and I think almost all of our tendency would be, for example, what the Jews did about the Sabbath. God says from Sinai, keep the Sabbath day holy. Don't do this, don't do that, blah, blah, blah. There's 20 or 30 words in that commandment, done. So then they come up with thousands of words, 39 categories of things you can't do. They keep putting hedge after hedge after hedge around the law to make sure that you'll never break it. Every conceivable option is considered. And it just gets more complicated and worse, to the point where people who would want to even be a part of the Jewish faith couldn't even figure out how to get into it because it was so hemmed about with regulations. Well, we sometimes do that with our own problems, don't we? We're going to create more and more things that might solve the problem that actually make the problem worse. You know, welcome to the government. So how do we avoid that? Here's how Paul avoids it. I would assign you, just for fun, to read the first book to the Corinthians, the first book of Corinthians, or the first letter to the Corinthians. It's fabulous. It's brilliant. And Paul, rather than trying to set up a whole bunch of rules and regulations about whether you ought to eat food that's been sacrificed to idols or all the questions that everybody was asking him, instead does this really counterintuitive thing, which is really the adjacent possible. He concentrates not on all the stuff that is wrong or that needs to be fixed. He concentrates on the one most powerful asset that there is to solve the problem. And what is the asset? He said, you weren't baptized to me. You weren't baptized to John or Apollo or anyone else. Thank heaven you were baptized to Christ. And thank heaven your faith in Christ is the most important thing. He says, our comely parts have no need. Let's start with the whole thing about the body. The body is not one member, but many. I'm in chapter 12, verse 14. If the foot shall say, because I am not the hand, I am not of the body, it is therefore not of the body. If the ear shall say, because I am not the eye, I am not of the body. You get how it's going? In other words, think of the parts of your body, how different they are. What pulls them all together? A conglomerate group of parts? It's the ruha. It's the spirit that holds your body together. It's the spirit that moves the body. So rather than saying, okay, all you eyes, you have to act more like hands. Hands, you have to wear white shirt and ties and look more like feet. Feet, you can't have any tattoos. You got to look like the ears. Everybody's got to look just alike, act just alike, and all feel the same way about everything. He says, no, you were all meant to be extremely different. But the breath that holds you together, the breath of life, is the testimony of Jesus. So here's how to solve an unsolvable problem in 5 minutes or less. Look at your assets. What is the positive thing that you know is good in that situation. Second question, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus do? Ask it again and again. No, seriously. What would Jesus do? It will be counterintuitive. It will be difficult. It may ruffle feathers, but it will be right. How to solve an unsolvable problem in 5 minutes or less. Look at the adjacent possible. What are the closest assets you have in that you could grab hold of? Concentrate on those. Forget about all the stuff that's in your way and ask, what would Jesus do? Write me and tell me how that works.